Elon has destroyed Twitter, and it's our job to recreate it. In this video, we're going to be creating a Twitter clone with the T3 stack. So what are all the things that we're going to be using to create this Twitter clone? Well, first off, we're going to use create T3 app to bootstrap the application. And inside create T3 app, we're going to get Next.js, Tailwind, Next.auth, and Prisma. We're also going to be using Day.js for our date formatting. So what sort of features is this application going to have? You're going to be able to log in with Discord, you're going to be able to create a tweet, you're going to be able to like a tweet, and you're also going to have infinite scroll. So what will you learn? We're going to learn about Discord OAuth, tRPC, cursor-based pagination, invalidating queries, manually updating the cache, formatting dates with Day.js. You're also going to learn useMutation, useQuery, and useInfiniteQuery. I'm not going to focus too much on the user interface, and I'm not going to build out every single feature Twitter has, and that's because I want you to take this application and I want you to make it your own. So you can use this application inside of your portfolio. So let's get started building this Twitter clone with the T3 stack. So I'm here in my terminal and I'm going to bootstrap a new application with create T3 app. I'm going to use PM2 to bootstrap my application, but you can also use npm and yarn. So I'm going to type npm create T3 app, and I'm going to call mine TWIT3R. So I'm going to select TypeScript. You can't actually select JavaScript, it doesn't work. And I'm going to enable Next.auth, Prisma, Tailwind, and tRPC. I do want to initialize a new directory, and I do want to run npm install. So I'm going to cd into twit3r, and I'm going to open this up in VS Code. So let's take a look around and see what create T3 app gives us out of the box. So we get this Prisma directory here, and this is because we said we do want to install Prisma. Inside of this Prisma directory, we have our Prisma schema. This is going to use SQLite out of the box, and we're going to be using SQLite for this tutorial just because it's easier. We get a public directory with just a fav icon, and all of the magic is going to live inside of this source directory. So we get our environment variables. We have some environment variables for client and for server. And we also have some schemas here for our server environment variables and for our client environment variables. Inside of pages, we have an API directory here. And if you're familiar with Next.js, this is going to be familiar to you. Inside of API, we have an auth directory, and this is going to house our Next.auth. And Next.auth is going to be used to set up all of our authentication providers. For this tutorial, we're just going to use the Discord provider that comes with Create T3 app. And that's because Discord is very easy to get started with. Next, we have the tRPC directory. And inside of here, we have this tRPC file. And this is going to create our Next API handler. We don't actually need to do any work inside of this directory here. And we also don't need to do any work inside of our Next.auth directory because we're going to use the provider that Create T3 app comes with. Next, we have an example page here, and we're not actually going to use this either. So we can go ahead and delete this example page. Next, we have this restricted page here, and this is just an example of a page that you can only view if you're authenticated. We can also delete this page here because we're not going to be using this. Next, we have our _app directory, and this is going to include our session provider and of course our component. We're going to do a little bit of work inside of app. We're just going to wrap our component in a main and a container. Next, we have our index page here, and this is going to house our timeline. You can see that we have one example query here to example.hello. If we go into server and we open up tRPC and we open up router, you can see that we have our example router here, and this is our hello query here. If we go back to our index page, you can see that our hello query is being called on our index page. We also have a get all, and this is going to find all of our Prisma example files. If we open up our Prisma schema, you can see that we have a model here for example. Let's go ahead and remove this example router here. And we can go back into our Prisma schema and we can remove this example model as well. Let's go back to our index page and we can now remove this hello query, because that will no longer work. And we can also remove this main here. And I'm just going to put a div, and then we can remove this auth showcase component. Next, we have our context file, and this is going to be used to build context for each request. You can see here that we have our session, which comes from get server auth session, and then we're going to be putting that into context, and this means that session is going to be available on all requests. We also have Prisma here, and Prisma comes from db/client, and this means that Prisma is also going to be available on each request. Next, we have this tRPC file here. And inside of tRPC, we get two helpful producers. We have our public producer, and we're going to use this to create routes that are open to the public, meaning they're not authenticated. Next, we have our private producer, and of course, this is going to be used for routes where we require the user to be authenticated. Next, we have our global styles, and we also have Tailwinds installed here. And then we have utils and tRPC, and this export here for tRPC is what we're going to be using on our client to make requests to our tRPC routers. If you have a look in the description below, you'll see a link to a GitHub repository. In that GitHub repository, you're going to see this notes file here. This notes file is going to include everything that you need to install to get started building this application. So I'm going to copy this command here. I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm going to paste this. I'm using p npm, but if you would like to use yarn, just replace this p npm here with yarn. So once those dependencies have finished installing, the first thing we want to do is to run yarn dev and make sure our application starts up successfully. So I'm in my browser, and we've come over to localhost port 3000, and of course our page is blank. So let's go back to our index page. And inside of our div here, we can just say hello from tRPC. And we can see that this text is now on our page, so our application is starting successfully. We have a few errors in the console here, and you can see that we're getting an error. Main.session does not exist on the current database. To fix this, let's run p npm Prisma, db, and push. Now if we run p npm dev again, and go over and refresh, and you can see that we're no longer getting these errors. Instead, we're getting some logs for our select queries. The first thing we need to do is to register an application so we can get our environment variables for Discord client ID and Discord client secret. So come over to discord.com/developers/applications, and I'm going to grab this URL, and I'm going to put this in this notes file here. And once you're in here, you can click create new application. I'm going to name mine TWIT3R. Now that we have our application, you're going to get an application ID. Let's copy this and paste this into Discord client ID. Next, we need to come over and click on OAuth 2. And we're going to be able to reset our client secret, say, yes, let's do it. I'm going to need to put in my authentication code. So I'm going to get my client secret here, and I'm going to copy this. Now I'm going to paste this into Discord client secret. I'm going to stop my application, and then I'm going to run p npm dev again. Now we've removed the link to our login. So let's go back to our index page here. And I'm just going to create a button. And this is going to say login. And on click is going to call a function. And this function is going to call sign in. And sign in is going to come from Next.auth/React. Let's save this. We can come back to our application. Let's click login, and you can see that we get redirected back to this login page. I'm going to click sign in with Discord, and then this is going to throw an error for us. And you can see here that it says invalid OAuth 2 redirect URI. So to fix this, we need to come back to our OAuth 2 application here, and we need to click add redirect, and then we can paste in this URL here. So this is going to be localhost port 3000/API/auth/callback/discord. And I'm going to add this to the notes file as well. So you can copy and paste this. So once you deploy this application, you can click add another redirect URL here, and you can put your deployed application's redirect URL here. So let's say our application was example.com. I would replace this with https example.com/API/auth/callback/discord. Click save changes. come back to our local application again and click login, click sign in with Discord. Now we can click authorize and we get redirected back to our home page. Let's copy this use session and I can say const equals use session. We can get data out of here and I'm going to rename data to session. Now I'm just going to JSON.stringify session here. Let's come back and you can see that we have my name and my email address and my image here. So the first thing I want to be able to do is to create a tweet. So let's come over to our schema here. And I want to create a new model and I'm going to call this model tweet. So I'm going to say model tweet. You can obviously call this model whatever you like. You might also want to be able to call it message, but this is going to be named tweet. So the first property I want to have is an ID, and I'm just going to copy this from my user model here. This is going to create a property called ID. It's going to be a string. It's going to be the ID for the tweet model. So we're going to be able to reference this in other models, and it's going to default to a UUID. Next, I want to have some text, and this is going to be a string. Next, I want to have an author, and this is going to be the user that creates the tweet. So this is going to reference our user model that sits up the top here. And I'm going to create an @relation. I'm going to set the fields that it's going to relate to author ID. And of course, we now need to create our author ID, and our author ID is going to be of type string. And then this is going to reference the ID field on the user property up here. So if this user property was called user ID, we would need to reference this as user ID down in our author field here. So Prisma is giving me an error here, and this is because in our user, we don't reference tweets. So when I save here, you're going to see that we now have an array of tweets that is called tweet on our user model. I'm going to rename this to a lowercase t. The reason that I get this autocomplete here is because in my extensions VS Code, I have this Prisma extension installed. If you go ahead and install this, it's going to give you some helpful autocomplete just like this. While you're installing extensions, go ahead and install the Tailwind CSS extension, the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin, and this is going to help us with some IntelliSense for Tailwind's CSS classes. Okay, so the last property that I want on my tweet is created at and updated at. So I'm going to have created at, it's going to be of type datetime, and it's going to default to now. So when we create a new tweet, created at is going to get set as the now date. Next, I want updated at, and this is going to be a special property that is going to get updated automatically every time we update this tweet object here. Let's stop our server, and I'm going to run p npm prisma db push again. I'm also going to split my terminal window here, and I'm going to run p npm prisma studio. And this is going to start the Prisma Studio for us. So you can see here that we have a few models. We have account, session, which come from create T3 app. We also have user and verification code, but now we also have this tweet model here. And you can see that we have an ID, text, author, author ID, created at, and updated at. Let's start our application back up again with yarn dev. So the next thing to do is to go create the router that is going to allow us to create a new tweet. So inside of router, I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to call this tweet.ts. I'm going to export const tweet router is equal to router, which comes from /tRPC. And router is going to take an object, and this is where we're going to put all of our different routes. So the first one we want is create. And if you're familiar with tRPC, then this is going to look a little bit different, because if we have a look in our package.json and we have a look at the version of tRPC that we're using, You can see that we're using version 10, so we're going to be using all of the version 10 features inside of this tutorial. So to create a tweet, we're going to require our users to be logged in. And remember, before we had two different producers. We had a public producer and we also had a protected producer. We're going to need to use this protected producer, which is going to use this isAuth middleware here, and this is going to check that the user has an active session. So let's say create is a protected producer. Next, we're going to have some input. And input is going to be a Z, which comes from Zod.object. And we have an error here. This is because this is supposed to be a dot, and then this is a function. So you can see here that it's protected producer dot input, and then we can also do dot mutation here as well. And this is where we're going to put our mutation callback. So inside of our Zod schema here, we're going to have one property, and this is going to be text, and this is going to be of type z.string. And we can also put an error in here. So we can put an object in here and we can say required error, and we can say tweet text is required. So down inside of our mutation, we're going to get an object here, and this is going to have our context and our input. So inside of context, we're going to have access to Prisma. So I'm going to say const, and I'm just going to destructure Prisma out of context. So you can see here that Prisma is available on context. Then I'm going to destructure our text out of input. And I'm just going to return Prisma dot tweet dot create. Then I'm going to pass in some data, and inside of data I'm going to pass in some text. We also need to connect the author, which means we need to have access to the session. So inside of context, I'm going to destructure my session out. I'm going to say const user ID is equal to session dot user dot ID. And now I'm going to say inside of data, the author is going to be author. Then we're going to connect, and we're going to connect the user where the ID is equal to our user ID. You'll notice that I did have a red squiggly line here that's now gone, and I can command click into this and we get some type definitions for tweet. The reason that is now gone is because I quit Visual Studio Code and reopened it again. If you get these errors here where Visual Studio is slow to catch up with the types, just exit it and then reopen it again and it should catch up. So this is our mutation to create a tweet complete. Let's go over and create a component where we can house a form that allows us to create a tweet. So I'm going to come over to my source directory and I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call this folder components. And inside of components, I'm going to create a new component called create tweet.ts. I'm going to export function create tweet. So I'm not going to use any form library here. And the reason is we're only going to have one form, and this is it here. So we're going to do the validation manually. If you're going to have several other forms inside of your application, it is worth using a form library like React Hook Form. So I'm going to say const equals useState. useState is going to default to an empty string, and this is going to be text and set text. Next, I'm going to return, and I'm just going to return a form element. And Visual Studio Code is complaining here. And the reason is because I've named this component create tweet.ts, and it needs to be .tsx. Okay, so inside of my form, I'm going to have a text area. And on change is going to be a function that calls set text. And then it's going to call set text with event.target.value. So we need to get our event here. Then I'm also going to have a div, and I'm going to have a button that says tweet. Then I'm going to have a function that's called handle submit. Now our tweet button is going to be of type submit. And then on our form, I'm going to have an on submit. And then this is going to call handle submit. The handle submit is going to get an event. And I'm going to call event.prevent default, because the default behavior is going to be to refresh the page. Okay, so now we need to get our mutation. So I'm going to say const mutation is equal to tRPC, which is going to come from /utils dot. And you can see here we have auth example, but we don't have tweet. The reason for that is because if we come back to our router and we come back to our _app, you can see here we have example and auth, but we don't have tweet. Let's remove example and replace this with our tweet router. And I want to name this tweet. You can name this whatever you like, and this is what's going to appear inside of this call here. So now we're going to do dot, we get tweet, dot, and we should be able to call .create. The reason we can call .create is because we've named this property here, create. If we named this create tweet and save that, you can see that create is no longer available, and it's actually going to be .create tweet. Let's rename this back to create. And then we can call dot, and we want to call .useMutation. Now this is going to return several properties. The property we want is mutate async. You could also remove mutate async here, and then you could destructure this to get out mutate async, or mutate, or several other properties that you would like to use. So inside of our handle submit, I'm going to say if text.length is less than, say, 10, then I just want to return. Otherwise, I want to call mutate async, and I want to call that with text. Let's also set an error up here. Error, set error. And we can set our error here. Return tweet must be at least 10 characters long. In fact, we can do something better here. We can create a schema. So let's say const tweet schema is equal to an object, and object is going to come from Zod. We're going to have our text, and our text is going to be a string, which also comes from Zod. So let's make sure we get that out. And let's say .min 1, actually let's change this to 10, and our max is going to be 280 characters here. Let's have a required error, and we can change this to tweet text. Now you'll notice that we have this tweet schema here, and if we go back to our tweet router, we also have another tweet schema here, and these are effectively the same thing. So what we can do is we can export this here. We can come back to our tweet router, remove this schema here, and I can say tweet schema, and I can import this from my component. Now let's run our text through our schema validation. So I can say try, await, and I can call tweet schema.pass. Now I can pass in my text as an object, and we're going to catch an error here. And if we get an error, we can set our error and return. Now we can remove this if block here, and handle submit needs to be an async function now. Otherwise, we're going to call mutate async. So the last thing we want to do is to display our error. So let's add a fragment here, and we can display this error outside of the form now. So I'm just going to say error and I want to JSON.stringify our error. Okay, so let's use this create tweet inside of our page. So if we go over to Twitter, you can see that our form to create a tweet is at the top of this timeline component here. So let's go back, and I want to create a new component inside of our components directory. And I want to call this timeline.tsx, and I'm going to export function timeline. And inside of timeline, I want to return, and I'm just going to return a div with our create tweet component. Now let's go back to our index page, and I want to render out my timeline. So you can see here we have an input and we have this tweet button here. So let's go add some styles to this to make it look a little bit better. So I'm just going to split my window here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get my timeline to sit in the middle of the page. So I'm going to come over to components, and I'm going to create a new component, and I'm going to call this container.tsx. Because if we go over and have a look at Twitter, you can see that Twitter has this 3-column system going on here. It has our navigation on the left, it has our timeline in the middle here, and then it has an explore section on the right-hand side here. Even if we go over to my Twitter page here, you can see that we still have the same layout. We have the timeline in the middle, we have my profile at the top here, and we have the navigation on the left, and then an explore panel on the right-hand side. We're just going to be focusing on this timeline section here for this tutorial. So for our container component, I'm going to export a function called container. And in container, I'm going to return a div. And that div is going to house our children. I'm going to get children, and then I'm going to type out our children as well. So I'm going to say children is type of React.React node. I'm also going to get some class names here, and that's so we can customize this container if we need to. Let's say class names is just going to be a string. So on our div, I'm going to say class names, and I'm going to make this some brackets and then some template strings here. I'm going to give this a max width is going to be XL, and then I'm going to give this a margin auto. And then this is going to get our container to sit in the middle of the page here. If you're going to use the 3-column system, then you wouldn't want to have the margin auto and the max width. You would just want to set the max width, and then you would have your navigation on the left and your panel on the right, which would get this to sit in the middle of the page. So next, I'm just going to have my class names. Okay, so let's come back to our _app inside of source/pages. And then I'm going to wrap our component in our container. And I'm going to move component page props above that. And container's throwing an error here. So I'm just going to make sure class names is optional. And it's also just going to default to an empty string. Let's give this a background color of, say, slate 600. So you can see here that our container is sitting in the middle of the page. Let's make this a little bit lighter. So while we're here inside of our _app, let's also just add a main component. And this just means that everything is going to be wrapped inside of a main. Okay, so let's come over to create tweet, and we can add some classes here as well. So I'm going to say class names, and then this is going to have a w full, which means that it's just going to take up the full width of this container. I'm going to say flex and flex col, and border is going to be 2, and the padding is going to be 4, and then I'm going to give this rounded of medium. And then I'm also just going to give it a margin bottom of 4. So for our text area, let's give these some class names as well. I'm going to put a shadow on my text area. I want to give this some padding of 4. And I want to give this a full width as well. So I'm going to say W full. Now for our button, I want to say class name is equal to BG primary. And you'll notice that doesn't change anything yet. We're going to fix that in just a second. I'll say text is going to be white. I'm going to give this a padding X of 4 and a padding Y of 2. And then rounded is going to be medium as well. So you can see that our button is sitting on the left here, where I want it to sit over on the right of the page here. So inside of this div, I'm going to give this some class names as well. So I'm going to say margin top is going to be 4. And I want to display this flex, and I want to justify end. So you can see now our tweet button sits over here on the right. Now to get this background color to appear, we need to go into our Tailwind config, and we need to extend our theme here. So to extend this, I want to say colors, and then I want to name this one primary. And I want to give it this hexadecimal value here, 1E40AF. And this is going to be this dark blue color here. So I don't like our login button up the top here. I want our login to sit in a little banner down the bottom. If we go open Twitter inside of an incognito window, you can see that we get this banner down the bottom here that says, don't miss what's happening, and then you can log in or sign up. So inside of components, I want to create a new component, and I want to call this logged out banner.tsx. And I want to export function logged out banner. Then I want to return a div. On that div, I want to give this some class names. So I want to say BG is going to be primary. I want to say that this is position fixed. So I want to say fixed. I want to set the bottom to 0. And then I want to set the width to 100. And the padding is going to be 4. And we don't need this W100. I can just say W full. Save that. Now I want to add a paragraph tag, and it says, do not miss out. Then I'm going to have a div. Inside of that div, I'm going to have a button. And I want to go over to my index page here, and I want to get this sign in button here. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to replace this button with that. And we need to import sign in, and sign in comes from use session. So let's copy this import here. At the top, let's say const data and rename data to session. Now I want to say if session, then just return null. So if the user's already logged in, then we don't want to show this banner. Let's copy this out for now so we can see this. And I'm going to come back over to _app. And just below main, I'm going to say logged out banner. So you can see the banner's a little bit off. What if we move this outside of our container? And you can see that this looks much better here. Let's use our container component here. And then this is going to give it a max width. So I'm just going to copy the ending bracket here. And I want to give this some class names. So I'm going to say BG is going to be transparent. So we don't want that gray background. And I'm going to say flex, and I want to say justify between, because I want my logout to sit on the left and then my login button to sit on the right. So I'm going to justify, and this is going to justify content space between. Let's style our login button with class names. I'm going to say text is going to be white. And let's also give this a shadow of medium. Let's also give it some padding of 4. Actually, let's say the padding on the X is 4, and then the padding on the Y axis is going to be 2. And this looks quite good. Let's say that I don't miss out. I'm going to have some class names as well. And I just want to make this equal to text white. And this looks much better. Okay, so if we're already logged in, then let's not display this banner. Okay, so the next thing to do is to test out this create tweet. So let's first up click tweet. And you can see here that we get this error code here. Too small, we have a minimum of 10, and string must be at least 10 characters. So let's open up our network panel. Let's put in at least 10 characters, click tweet. We can see that we sent a request successfully. Let's have a look at preview, and we don't get any errors. Let's go over to our Prisma Studio, refresh on tweets, and you can see that we now have our tweet here. So now that we can create a tweet, let's go ahead and seed our database with a bunch of users and tweets so we can list them out and see what it looks like when we have a lot of content. So I'm going to stop my server here. So inside of my Prisma directory here, I'm going to paste this seed file here. And this is so we can run Prisma DB seed. If you would like to seed your database with this content here, then you can copy this seed file from the GitHub repository that is in the description below. Let's have a look at what it is that we're going to be doing. So first we have this user to create, and this is just set to 20. So this means that we're going to create 20 users. Then we have a tweets min and tweets max. And this is going to be used to pick a random number between 1 and 20, whatever value we have here. Then we're going to use that value to create that many tweets for that user. And we're just going to use faker lorem sentence to create a fake tweet for the user. So to run this seed file, we need to go into our package.json. And I need to say Prisma. And then Prisma needs to have a seed. And then we need to tell Prisma where we can find this seed file. So I'm going to use tsx, prisma/seed.ts. And tsx is just what we're going to use to run this TS file here. So now that Prisma knows where to find the seed file and how to run it, we can run pnpm prisma db seed. And you can see that our seed file has been executed successfully. Let's go over to Prisma Studio and see what data we have. You can see that we now have a bunch of tweets. And you can see, if we go over to users, we also have a lot of users. These users have an image, they have an email address, and they have a name. Let's start our application up again with pnpm dev. And we want to go over to our tweet router. And just under create, I want to have another property on our object here. And this is going to be called list. So list is going to be a public producer. And this is a public producer because I want to be able to view tweets even if the user is logged out. Called .input. And I'm not going to have any input for now. Then I'm going to call .query. On query, we're going to destructure our context. And I also want to destructure my input. So for input, let's define a schema, and this is going to be a Z, which comes from Zod.object. And for now, I'm just going to have my cursor, and I'm also going to have a limit. So my cursor is going to be nullish, and my limit is going to be a Z.number. The min is going to be 1, and then the max is going to be 100. And then I'm just going to default to, let's say, 10. So this is going to be the number of tweets that we fetch on each request. It's not guaranteed to be the maximum number because we could hit the end of our pagination, or we could hit the last cursor. Okay, so let's destructure Prisma and our cursor and limit. So Prisma is going to come out of context. I'm going to say const is equal to input. And this is going to be our cursor and our limit. Okay, so I'm going to start off really simple with this query, and then we're going to slowly build on it and make it more complicated. So I'm going to call const tweets is equal to await. Prisma.tweet.findMany. Then I'm going to return an object, and inside of that object, I'm going to put my tweets here. So the first thing I want to do is to order by, and order by is going to be an array, and inside of that array, I'm going to have one object, and this is going to be created at and descending. And this is so we get the newest tweets first. Okay, so let's save this, and we can go over to our timeline, and then we can use this simple query, and then we can come back and we can build on it as we discover problems with this query. I'm going to come over to my timeline, and I'm going to say const, and I'm going to destructured data is equal to tRPC, and we need to make sure tRPC comes from utils. And we need to call .list. In fact, Copilot was saying timeline here, and this is probably a better name for this query. So we can come back over to our tweet router, and let's rename this query here. And I'm going to rename this to timeline. So .timeline.useQuery. And useQuery now expects some input. So I can just give this an empty object for now. We're going to get our data back. So we're going to say json.stringify, and we're going to get our data. Let's go have a look at this. And you can see that we get an object with a property of tweets, and then inside of that property, we get an array, and then we should have all of our tweets here. So our limit hasn't been applied. So let's go back and fix that problem. So on our timeline query here, I want to say take, and take is going to be our limit. So I want to limit this to limit, and I want to limit to +1. So I'll explain the +1 after, but essentially what we're going to do is we're going to pop the last tweet off, and we're going to use that to get our cursor. Let's go back, we can refresh again. And you can see that we should only have 11 tweets here now. So you'll notice that we didn't actually set a limit here, but our limit is still getting applied. The reason is because we've defaulted this to 10. So we want to say if the client doesn't give us a limit, then just apply one for them. We can also override that limit here. So I can say limit, and then this limit is going to be 2. If we go back and refresh, you can see that we only get 2 tweets here. Up the top here, let's create a new component for each individual tweet. So I'm going to say function tweets. So you can obviously create this component inside of a new file if you like, but I think it's only ever going to be used here. And so it's kind of nice to just have it with the timeline. Let's say we're going to get one property here, and this is going to be our tweet. And let's type this out. So our tweet, and we need to get whatever this query here is going to return. So we can do that by using router outputs, then we can get tweet, then we can get timeline. And then we just want to get a single tweet because this is going to be an array. So I want to get our tweets, and then I want to get a number. So now let's return a div. And inside of that div, I'm going to have another div. And then I want to have the author's image. So I'm going to say image, and this is going to come from next/image. The source is going to be tweet.author.image. Okay, so we're getting an error here, and that's because we haven't included the author on the tweet. So let's go fix that issue. So under order by, I'm going to say include author. And I don't want to include all of the author's properties because I don't want to expose their email, for example. So I'm going to say select. Then I want to select the name. That's going to be true. I want to select the image. That's going to be true. And just for good measure, let's also select the user's ID. So this needs to be tweet.author.image. Okay, so there's some other properties we need to give this. We need to give this an alt text. So I'm going to open up my brackets here. I'm going to open up my template strings. I'm going to say tweet.author.name profile picture. I'm going to give this a width of 48, a height of 48, and they're just two numbers that GitHub Copilot gave me, and so I'm going to use them. Okay, so let's also give this a class name of rounded full. So source is complaining, and that's because the image can be null. So let's just say, just display this if the image is not null. And now Copilot is happy. So let's iterate through all of our tweets here. So I'm going to say data.tweet.map. And let's return, and we're going to get our tweet here. We're going to return a tweet. I'm going to give this a key of tweet.id, a property of tweet, and then this is going to be our tweet. Let's have a look at this. So Next is giving us an error, and the reason is because we don't have a valid source property. We need to add this hostname to our Next config. So let's click on this, and I'm going to grab this hostname of Cloudflare ipfs.com. Now I'm going to come over to our Next config. And inside of this config, I'm going to say images. Then I'm going to say domains, and I'm going to have an array of domains. So this is going to be Cloudflare ipfs.com. We'll also need to add our Discord domain as well, because that's where our image is going to come from. Let's go over to Prisma, and we can see users, and we can see my user here. Let's copy my user's image address, and we can add another property here. We don't need the full domain. We just need the domain host. So we can remove the protocol. Let's stop our application, and we can restart it. Go back over and have a look at our application. So if we refresh this, you can see that we get our user's profile pictures. I'm going to split my window again so I can style this tweet. Let's have a look at Twitter, and you can see that for a tweet, we have the user's profile picture, we have their name, and then we have the content of the tweet just below the name. So I'm going to do roughly the same for this. So I'm going to remove this JSON stringer file here. In my wrapping div, I'm going to give this some class names. So I'm going to give this a class name of margin bottom of 4, and then a border of bottom of 2. And then I want to give it a border gray 500. So in this next div, I want to give this some class names of flex and padding 2. So the reason I'm adding the padding here and not on this outer div is because I want to add a border to this whole timeline here. And I want this border here to go the full width across that timeline. So if we add a border on the timeline, actually, let's add it just to the tweets here. So I can move this data inside of this div here and add a class name of border 2 and a border of gray 500, same as we did at the top, gray 500. You can see that the border goes all the way around, and then we have this border here that goes the full way across for each tweet. And let's say this border is actually border of left 2 and a border right of 2, and then a border top of 2. And now we don't get that weird border down the bottom here. So down below our image here, let's go add another div, and I want to add I want to put the user's name. So I'm going to have a P, and then this is going to be tweet.user, tweet.author.name. So the name appears there. And just to the right of the name, I want to have it say the date that the tweet was created. So let's add another p tag, and this is going to be tweet.created@. And then for now, I'm just going to wrap this in a new date. And I'm going to say .to ISO string. And I'm going to format this date later on with Day.js. Okay, so we need to display this flex, a class name flex. And I need to add a dash here. And I need to add one more space. Okay, so just down below our name, I want to add another div. So let's wrap all of this in one more div. And then inside of this div here, I want to have my tweet.text. And this div, I'm going to give this a class name of margin left of 2. So this is going to move our text and name over just a little bit. So on our tweet name here, I'm going to give this a class name of font bold. So I want the user's name to be bold. And then on our date here, I'm going to give this a class name of text sm. And then the color, actually this is going to be text gray 300. Actually, let's make this 400. Yep, that looks good. Now I want the name and the date to line up. So I'm going to say align center. So to format our date, I'm going to use Day.js. So I'm going to remove new date here, and I'm going to say Day.js, and then I want to call dot from now. And from now is not going to exist on Day.js. We need to extend Day.js to include from now. So if we come up to our imports, we can import our extensions for Day.js. So I'm going to import relative time from Day.js /plugin/relative time. And I'm also going to import update local from Day.js /plugin/update local. Now I want to call Day.js.extend, and I want to call this with relative time. And I also want to call Day.js extend with update local. And now I can format my times with update local. So I'm going to call Day.js.update local, and I'm going to update my English times here. So for our relative dates, there's a few properties we need to put in here. I'm just going to copy these from the Day.js documentation. I'm going to paste these in. So you can see here that this says minutes ago, and I'm just going to update these to 1M. For 1 minute, it's just going to be 1M again. For multiple minutes, it's just going to be DM. And you can see that this has changed for 32 minutes ago. For 1 hour, it's going to be 1H. DH, for 1 day, it's just going to be 1 day. And then DH, for 1 month, it's just going to be 1 capital M. For multiple months, it's just going to be 1% D capital M. For 1 year, it's going to be 1Y. And then for multiple years, it's just going to be DY. So the next thing to do is to load in more tweets. And then once we scroll to the bottom, it should load in even more. So let's change the number that it loads in here from 2 to 10. So now we're loading in 11 tweets. And when we scroll to the bottom, it should load in more. So I'm going to move this back over. Let's go back over to our tweet router here. And we also need to return a cursor with our tweets. So I'm going to say let next cursor is going to be type of cursor. And we need to get cursor in from input or undefined. Sorry, this should be type of cursor. So we're just going to infer the type from our cursor or undefined, and then it's going to default to undefined. Next, we're going to say if tweets.length is greater than the limit of tweets that we have. So if we've loaded in 11 tweets, but our limit is set to 10, then I want to say const next item is equal to tweets dot pop as type of tweet and then number. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're going to define a property called next item. Then we're going to pop off the last item on our tweets. So if we have our limit set to 10, we should actually get 11 items back because we've put +1 here. So this is going to modify our array here. It's going to remove the last item and it's going to assign it to this next item property here. So we'll no longer return 11 items when we've actually said we just want to return 10. Next, I can say next cursor is equal to next item dot ID. And I want to put next cursor inside of our return here. Let's go back over to our timeline. And in data, we should get data dot next cursor. If we go over and we scroll to the top, and you can see at the top, we get our next cursor. And this is the item that is in the next position that we need to load from. So we're going to get our cursor back in this property here. And I can say cursor. And then this is going to be, if we do have a cursor, then we're going to use the ID as the cursor. Otherwise, it's just going to be undefined, which means we're at the start of the page. Okay, so how can we use this cursor? If we go back to our timeline here, instead of using query, we can use what's called an infinite query. We can say use infinite query. Now, our infinite query is going to return several other things. On top of our data, it's going to return a has next page. It's going to return a function to fetch next page. And we can also get is fetching, which was always there. So on top of our properties here, we need to provide another object here. And this other object is going to be get next page param. And we're going to get this from our last page. And then we're going to call last page dot cursor, dot next cursor, sorry. So this is a parameter that we're going to put inside of our next query. And then this is also going to be used to determine whether we have another page. Because if our next cursor returns undefined, it means that we don't have a next page. Okay, so next cursor is now undefined, and you'll notice that tweets is also undefined. The reason for this is because if we do const tweets is equal to data dot, you'll see that we get our page params and we also get pages. So if we call dot pages, you can see that we can flat map this. And this just means that we're going to flatten out our pages. Let's console.log our data. So console.log data, and we can have a look at what this data now looks like. We can remove our data from here, and then this is going to be happy, and we can reload our page. And if we have a look at our data, you can see we have our page params. At the moment, we just have one page loaded in. And so our pages array just includes one item. When we load in more tweets, we're going to have multiple pages loaded down here. And this is why we need to flat map our pages. So for now, let's just say add a button here. And then this button is just going to say load next. And I'll say on click, and then on click, it's going to call fetch next page. And I just want to disable this button if not has next page or is fetching. So this probably should be is fetching, not is fetched. So if we scroll down to the bottom here, we can see that we get this button load next. We can click this, and now we're going to load in 10 more tweets. We can click it again, load in 10 more tweets, click it again, and we can keep clicking this and loading in more tweets. What we want to do is we want to be able to scroll to the bottom of the page and it load in more tweets automatically for us. To do that, we need to create a custom hook. So I'm going to come up above our tweet here, and I'm going to create a hook called useScrollPosition. So I'm going to say function useScrollPosition. I'm going to say const equals useState. And then the scroll position is going to default to 0. And this is going to be scroll position and set scroll position. I'm going to have a function called handle scroll. So function handle scroll. Then I'm going to have a use effect. Just going to have a callback. We're going to have a dependency array here. I'm going to add an event listener to our window object. So this is going to be window.add event listener. And I want to add an event listener to our scroll. And then when we get a scroll, I want to call handle scroll. I want to set passive, and I want to set this to true. So when this component unmounts, I need to remove this event handler. So I'm going to return a function, and then this is going to call window.remove event listener scroll, and then we want to remove our function handle scroll. So inside of handle scroll, the first thing we need to do is to get the height. So I'm going to say const height is equal to document element dot scroll height. And then we need to minus document element dot client height. Now we need to get the window scroll. So I'm going to say window scroll is equal to document dot body dot scroll top, or document element dot scroll top. And we need to assign this to a const. Okay, so now we need to say const scroll is equal to our window divided by our height. And let's spell height properly, height. And then we want to times this by 100 to get a whole number. Then we can call set scroll position to scrolled. And then down the bottom here, under our use effect, I just want to return our scroll position. Okay, so inside of our timeline here, I say const scroll position is equal to use scroll position. So let's console.log our scroll position. So console.log scroll position. Open up the console. Now we can scroll, and you can see that our scroll position here is getting updated. When we scroll to the bottom, it gets set to 99.94. Let's detach this window here. And I want to put that over to the side. Clear this out. We'll scroll to the top, and we get our scroll position back to 1. Scroll to the bottom, and our scroll position gets to 100. So when we get over, say, 90%, we want to load in the next set of tweets. If you would like to optimize this a little bit further, you could debounce this handle scroll function here, so it only gets updated when the user stopped scrolling for, say, 500 milliseconds. Let's come back down to our timeline here. And I'm going to add a use effect hook here. Add a callback, and I'm going to add a dependency array. And then I'm going to say if the scroll position is greater than 90, and we have our next page, has next page, and we're not already is fetching, then I want to call fetch next page, and I want to execute that. Now we need to add some items to our dependency array here. We need to add our fetch next page is fetching, and our scroll position. So let's do that. Our scroll position, handle next page is fetching, and our fetch next page function. Let's remove this. Let's reload this page, and we can scroll down to the bottom, and you can see that our sidebar over here keeps getting smaller, and we keep loading in more items. Down the bottom here, let's add some text. And this is going to say no more items to load. And then we're going to say, if not has next page, then I want to show this text here. And you can see if we come down to the bottom here, we have my old tweet and no more items to load. So the next feature I want to add is the ability to like and unlike a tweet. And we also want to show the count of the likes on a tweet. Let's go back over to our Prisma schema here. And we need to create a schema for a tweet like. So I'm going to say model like. A like is going to have an ID. I'm just going to copy that from our tweet. Next, we're going to have the tweet that the user liked, and this is going to be a reference to a tweet. I'm going to say at relation. Our fields is going to be tweet ID, which is going to exist on this like model, and it's going to reference the ID on tweet, which is this property up here. So we're going to have our tweet ID. Next, we're going to have the user that liked the tweet. And again, we're going to have our user ID, which is going to be a string. And then this is going to reference the user's ID. I'm going to have my created at, and I'm going to have updated at. So I saved this, and this is going to go ahead and update our tweet with our like. I'm just going to change this to, lowercase likes. I like the name of that better. And then if we go back up to our user, we should also see the likes on a user. And again, I'm going to change this to lowercase l, and I'm going to change it to plural. So we have a constraint here that we need to enforce at the database level. A user can only like a single tweet once. So this means that if I like a tweet, it's going to create a record with the tweet ID and my user ID. I want to be able to say that those two together are unique. And in doing so, I'm making a key that is going to be enforced. So I'm going to say at unique, and then I'm going to put in my tweet ID and my user ID. Now we cannot have any record in our database that both share a tweet ID and a user ID, meaning that I can only like a tweet a single time. Let's stop our application here, and I'm going to run p npm prisma db push. Now I'm going to start up my application again. I'm going to close down the Prisma Studio to make sure that we get our changes. Then I'm going to go over to my studio, and I'm going to make sure I have a like, and we have no records in here. So let's go over to our timeline, and I want to add a button that is going to call this mutation. So inside of our tweet function here, down below, for the last closing div, I'm going to have another div here. And inside of this div, I'm going to have AI fill heart. And this is going to come from React icon. So I need to import that. Import from React icons / AI. So AI fill heart. I'm going to say the color here for now is just going to be red. And the size is just going to be 1.5 rem. And then on click, just going to have a function that calls console.log like tweet. Let's go over. You can see we have our red heart here. I want to add some padding to this. I'm going to say class name. And this is going to be flex. I want to add a margin top of 4. And I want to add padding of 2. So now you can see it sits in line with our profile picture here. Let's add a number here. So I'm going to add the number 10. And you can see that these sit nicely together. I'm going to add 10. I'm going to add a span. And I'm going to add a class name. And then this is going to be text SM. So that makes it a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to say text is going to be gray, say 500. And I think that looks a little bit more natural. On this wrapping class, I'm going to say items is going to be center. And now this sits in the center here. So when I click this heart button here, I want to create a new like record. So let's get rid of our color here of red. I'm just going to comment that out. So now let's go back to our tweet router. And I'm just going to collapse this so I can see what I'm working with. You can see that we have our create mutation. We have our timeline query. I'm going to have a like, and this is going to be a protected producer because you have to be logged in to like a tweet. We're going to have input. The input is going to be an object. We're going to have the tweet ID. Then we're going to have our mutation. And we can fill this in just a second. What we do, let's copy this and let's change this to dislike. Actually, let's change this to unlike. So if you click like, you're going to create a like record. And then if you click unlike, so you click the like button again, it's going to delete that like record. So I want to say const user is equal to context.session.user. And then I actually want to just get the user's ID. I'm going to say user ID. We can guarantee this exists because we're using this protected producer here. If we go back and have a look at this one more time, you can see isAuth guarantees that this session actually does exist. So we don't need to do any checking to make sure our user ID does exist. We're guaranteed for that to exist here. So I'm going to get Prisma out of context, and then I'm going to return Prisma.like.create. I'm going to set data. I'm going to set the tweet, and then I'm going to connect a tweet, and I'm going to connect it where the ID is input.tweetID. Next, I want to do the same, but I want to connect a user. So I'm going to connect the user where the ID is equal to our user ID, which comes out of our session. So Visual Studio Code is complaining here, but we know this exists because we have a look in Prisma Studio and it does exist. So I'm just going to try reload our window here and see if this helps us out. And it looks like VS Code does like this now. So we can command click on this and we can see our like property here. So now that we have this mutation, let's actually just copy all of this. And I'm going to paste this down into our unlike mutation. And instead of creating a record, I'm just going to delete a record. So delete doesn't take any data. It actually takes a where clause. So we can say where. And I want to delete where our tweet ID, user ID composite key includes a tweet ID of input.tweetID, and the user ID is equal to our user ID that we got out of our session. And the reason that this exists is because if we go back to our schema, it's because we put this unique property here. If I command click into delete and then go into our delete args and then where, you can see that tweet ID and user ID does actually exist. Let's remove this unique constraint here and I'll run p npm prisma db push again. Now, if we go back into our delete, we go back into args and our where clause, you can see that it no longer exists. So this does come from our unique property here. Let's put it back with db push. And this is going to remove all of our data. So I'm going to say yes. And then I can start our application back up again. And you can see that our tweet ID, user ID does actually exist here again. So what I want to do is I want to go back to my timeline. And then when I click on a heart, I want you to create a like record. And then if I have liked a tweet, I want it to delete that like record. So I need to create these mutations. So I can say const like mutation is equal to tRPC dot tweet dot like dot use mutation. Execute that, and then I want to get the mutate async function. I want to do the same for dislike. Sorry, we called it unlike, didn't we? And I want to rename this to unlike. And I need to name this unlike, not unline. So on our like, I want to say on click. I want to call like mutation. And I want to call this of the tweet ID, and this is going to be tweet.id. Okay, so let's go try this out. So I'm going to click this, nothing happens, but we can go look in our database here, and we can refresh, look at likes, and you can see that we do have a like record here. Let's go try click this again. So click, And you can see that we get an error because we've violated that unique constraint that we created between a tweet ID and a user ID. So now we need to show if I've liked this tweet, the heart should be red. And if I haven't liked the tweet, it should just be this dark color here. I also need to show the count of likes on a tweet. So I'm going to come over to my tweet router here. And then in our timeline, I want to expand my query. So under our include clause here, we have our author, but we also want to include likes. And I want to include likes where the user ID is equal to our user ID. So let's make sure we have our user ID. So I'm going to say const user ID is equal to context session user ID. Of course, we can't guarantee that user ID does exist because this is not a protected route. It is a public route. So we can remove this second user ID here. And then I just want to select, and the only thing I want to select is the user ID, and I'll set that to true. Let's go over to our timeline, and I just want to log out our tweets here. So console.log tweets. Open up our console and we can refresh the page. And we should see in the 0th element here, we have likes, and our likes array is filled in with our current user's ID. If we have a look at the second one here, you can see that likes is an empty array. So now we can say const has liked is equal to tweet.likes.length is greater than 0. So now we can use this has liked property, and I can say if has liked, then we want to call our dislike mutation. So this is going to be actually unlike mutation with our tweet.id. And then we need to return. And if we have liked, then I want the color to be red. Otherwise, I want it to be gray. Okay, so our tweet here is red if we have liked it, and then it's gray if we haven't. If I click this, you can see it does nothing, and then I refresh and it goes red. There's two ways we can fix this. The first and easy way to fix this is to just invalidate this query down here. And I'm going to show you how to invalidate a query later on. And we're going to do this the more complicated way. The reason we're going to do this the more complicated way is because if we scrolled right down to the bottom of the page here, we could have hundreds of tweets that we've loaded in. I don't want to have to reload all of these tweets again. And so we just want to update the cache in place. We're going to have to update this cache in two places. The first place we're going to have to do it is when we like a tweet and then when we unlike a tweet. So because we're going to have to do it twice, I'm going to create a function that is going to help us do this. So I'm going to say function update cache. This update cache function is going to take a few arguments. The first one is going to be our client. I'm going to say client, and this is going to be of type query client. So client is a query client, which comes from 10stack/React query. The next property is going to be our variables. So variables, then we're going to have our data, and then we're going to have our action. So our variables is just going to be the variables that we passed into like and unlike. So this is going to be a tweet ID, which is going to be a string. Then we're going to have our data. And for now, I'm just going to say our data is a user ID, going to be a string. And then we're going to have our action, and our action is going to be like or unlike. So now we need to say client.setQueryData. Before we go any further, let's actually add the React Query dev tools, and we can see what this query data actually is. So I'm going to come over to _app. And just below our logged app banner, I want to add React Query Dev Tools. And I need to import these from @10stack /React Query dev tools. And we need to install this actually. So let's say npm add and then -- save dev. And from here, we can get the React Query dev tools. So now we can render these React Query dev tools. I also want to pass in an option for initial open. Initial is open, and I just want to set this to false. So let's do npm dev again. So you'll see down the bottom here, we get the React Query icon. If we click this, you can see that we have this one query here. If we click on this, you can see that this is the query that we use to load this page. So now we can scroll down here and we can see what the query is that we're actually going to be updating. So you can see in state, we have data, we have pages, and then we have one page here with tweets. And then these are all the items we're going to update here. So when we like a tweet, we're going to dive into our pages. We're going to dive into our tweets. We're going to find the tweet that we just liked, and we're going to set the likes to an array that includes our user's ID. So that may sound complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it quite slowly. So now we need to call client.setData, and we need to pass an array, and this is the query key we used. tRPC is going to create this query key for us, but if we have a look here, you can see what this query key is. It's tweet and timeline. So we can copy that and we can put that into our array here. And this needs to be a 2-dimensional array. And then in the second property of this array, we need to pass in an object. And this is the variables that we called our query with. You can see here, our variables is input and then limit. So at the moment, it's just limit here. So we can copy this. Now I can pass this into the object here. Now, after our array, we're going to get a callback. And inside of our callback, we're going to get some old data. Let's just console.log out our old data. So far, we're not using this update cache. So I'm just going to copy this. And then when we like a tweet in our useMutation, I'm going to say on success. And on success is going to be a function. And then we're going to call update cache. Now I need to get my client. So I could just create a client in here, or I can pass it into our tweet. If we pass it in, it means we create one instance of our client. If we create our client here, it means that we create an instance of our client for every single tweet. So I'm going to create our client up a level inside of our timeline here. So I'm going to say const client is equal to tRPC dot useQueryClient. So I'm going to say const client is equal to useQueryClient, and we can execute that. Now we can pass our client into each tweet here. Let's go back up to our tweet. We can say we're going to get our client, and our client is going to be of type query client. Now we can pass our client into update cache. We can pass in our data, which comes from onSuccess. We can pass in our variables, which also comes from onSuccess. And it's going to be the second argument. Then we can pass in our action, and our action here is going to be like. Let's copy this down, and we can do the same when we dislike a tweet. So I'm just going to copy this whole object here, and I'm going to pass this in for dislike. And instead of the action being like, it's going to be unlike. Let's go over to our page here, and I can refresh, clear out our console, and then I'm going to like a tweet, and you can see we get our old data, and our old data for some reason is undefined. So the reason we're getting undefined, if we open up our dev tools again, you can see here that we actually call this query with limit 10 and type of infinite. Let's just copy this whole array here, and we can pass this in as the first argument. You can see that we have type is infinite, our input, and our limit here. Let's go back. We can close our dev tools. Now let's like another tweet, and you can see that we get our old data. Our old data is going to include our pages, and then our pages is going to include all of our tweets here. So what we need to do is we need to find the tweet that we just liked, and then we need to say in our likes array here, we're going to put the user's ID. So open up our Prisma Dev Tools, and I'm just going to remove all of these likes here, just so it makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so I want you to define a variable called new data, and then this is just going to equal old data as infinite data. Then I want to pass in my router outputs, and I want to pass in tweet and timeline. So this is going to define new data, and we're going to have some types here for this. Okay, so next I want to say const new tweets is equal to new data.pages.map. So we need to return a structure that looks exactly like this structure here. So pages, and then inside of pages, we have tweets. So inside of this map, we need to return, and we need to return this property here of tweets. We're going to return tweets. And then this is going to equal page.tweets.map. And I want to say if tweet.id is equal to variables.tweetID. Now I can modify this tweet here. So I want to return an object of tweet. Then I want to return the likes. And inside of the likes, I'm going to have the user's ID. So this is going to come from data.userID. So this is going to work if we've liked a tweet, but what happens if we unliked a tweet? I want to say if action is equal to like, then we can do this. Otherwise, we just want to set this back to an empty array. This is action with a triple equals, not assigning the value. So if it's not the tweet that we're modifying, then we just want to return the tweet. So I just want to return tweet. Then down the bottom here, I want to return an object with new data. And then our pages is going to be equal to our new tweets here. Let's remove this console.log. And I want to close my DevTools. You can see if I click this tweet, it goes red. And if I click it again, it goes back to gray, which means I've unliked it. Let's go update the count here. So if we go back to our tweet router, we need to count the number of likes a tweet has. So under author here, I'm going to say underscore count. And then I want to select likes, and I want to select true. Okay, so on our tweet now, we should have a count of likes. Let's go back to our timeline. And on our tweet where we display a number, instead of just displaying 10, I want to say tweet.count.likes. So you can see all of them have 0 likes. Let's click this. Now we can refresh, and you can see that we have 1 like. Let's click it again, and it goes back. We need to update this, and we can update this again manually by updating our cache in place. So down here where we set our likes, I just want to now set my count. And I can set my count to action is equal to like. Then I want to set my count to whatever count is plus 1. So I can say const value is equal to action is equal to like. Then I want to set it to 1. Otherwise, I want to set it to -1. So I'm just going to add my value. So if I add -1, it's going to subtract 1. So now I can say my count is equal to an object with likes, And then this is going to be tweet dot count dot likes, and it's just 1 underscore for count, plus my value. Let's go back and we can try this again. I'm going to click this and you can see that it gets updated in place. And then I can click it again and it gets set back to 0. Let's like a bunch of tweets. Now I'm going to go over to Prisma Studio and I'm going to grab a user's ID that isn't my user. I'm going to grab this second user here, copy their ID, open up likes, and I'm just going to replace all these likes with this other user's ID. We can save that. Now we can go back, refresh, and you can see that these all have 1 like each, but I haven't liked them. So I can click like, and this goes up to 2 now. If we refresh, it stays at 2. Let's try adding a tweet here. Hello from Tom. And if we click tweet, it doesn't actually do anything. Let's refresh, and you can see that our tweet is here. So the other option to updating the case is to invalidate a query. Let's go do that now when you create a tweet. We're going to come over to create tweet. And I'm going to define a property called util. So const utils is equal to tRPC.useContext. Now we can use utils here to do a bunch of different stuff, but what we're going to use it for is to invalidate the cache. When you invalidate the cache, it's going to force tRPC to refetch all of that data. So inside of our useMutation here, I'm going to have an onSuccess. And this is going to be a function. And this is going to set text back to an empty string. That's a good call. But we're going to also call utils.tweet.timeline.invalidate. And then we're going to execute that. Come back over and we can refresh, say hello again. We can tweet, and hello again appears here automatically. So the next thing we want to do is to be able to click on a user and go over to their profile. Because we already have a timeline built out here with infinite scroll, this is going to be really easy. Let's go over to our pages. And I'm going to create a new page here. And I'm going to say brackets name.tsx. And I'm going to export default function user page. Then I'm just going to return a div. And on this div, I'm going to have my timeline. So from the timeline, let's link to this page. So I'm going to import a link from next/link. And this I needs to be lowercase. So I'm going to use this link here. And I'm going to say user. So I'm going to come down to the author's name here. And inside of the p tag, I'm going to have my link. And I'm just going to say the href is equal to / and then tweet.author.name. Let's go back and we can click on this. And you can see that we get a timeline. This timeline has every single user's tweet on it, but we just want to display the tweets for that given user. So what we need to do here is to add a filter to our timeline. So let's come over to our tweet router. And on our tweet timeline here, I'm going to have a where clause. And then my where clause is going to be a z.object. And then on that object, I'm going to have a name, which is going to be a z.string. And this is going to be optional. In fact, our where clause is going to be optional as well. So now we can just pass this where clause in. So I can say where, like this, and I need to destructure where out of input. In fact, this is not correct. Where should actually be where the author, and then we can filter based on the author. So the author is going to be a z.object. And then inside of our author, I'm going to have name, and then this is going to be z.string.optional. So now TypeScript is happy. So you can pass whatever properties in here that you like. So if you want to filter based on the author's ID, you would just add the author's ID here, and then that would get passed directly into your where clause here. The reason that this is safe to do and we don't need to do any sanitization is because Zod is going to do that sanitization for us. So the only thing that you can pass in here is where the author's name is equal to a string. You can't just pass anything in here because otherwise Zod is going to throw an error. Okay, so let's go over to our timeline, and I'm going to have where here, and we can infer the type of where. So I'm going to say where, and this is going to be of type router inputs, and the router is going to be tweet, and then the query is going to be timeline, and then the property is going to be where. So now we can pass our where clause into here. And I just want to default our where clause to an empty object. And TypeScript is complaining. Let's go over and say that where, and we're going to make all of these objects optional and see if TypeScript is happy now. It's not happy yet. So where author is missing on type object. So author here is an object, and this should be optional as well. So now TypeScript is happy. You can have a where clause with an empty object. Go over to the user's name, and I want to get the user's name out of the query. So I'm going to say const router is equal to use router, and then const name is equal to router.query.name as a string. Now I want to say where, I'm going to pass in an object. My object is going to have the author. I'm going to pass in the name of the author. Now this should filter our timeline by the author's name. And you can see here that it has all of my tweets and no other users' tweets. Let's create a tweet here, and our query still gets invalidated. Let's go back to our home page and make sure our like still works. So I can like it, and I get an error here. Cannot read pages. So if we open up our query here, you can see that we now have a where, and the where is going to be an empty object. Let's go back to our timeline. And in our update cache function, I need to pass in my where clause, which is going to be an empty object. So let's try this again, refresh. I can like and I can dislike. What about going to a user's page? So I want to go to this user here, and I want to like their tweet, and this doesn't work. The reason is because our where clause is no longer an empty object. You can see we're using where the author's name is this name here. So let's get our where clause from our timeline. So I'm going to say, in fact, let's just get all of our input from our timeline. So I'm going to say input, then I can type input as router input, and this is going to be, tweet, and then it's going to be timeline. Now we can just pass our input into here. And let's copy the type definition here for our update cache input, because we're going to need that on our tweet as well. So I'm going to say input, and then I want to paste that definition here. We can pass input into our update cache. Now for our usage of tweet, this is going to be invalid because we need to pass in our input as well. So I'm going to say input is equal to an object. We're going to have our where that we passed in here. So we're going to have this where here. And we're also going to have our limit here. Let's define a constant for our limit. In fact, we should do this at the top here. So const limit is equal to 10. So if we want to change our limit, we just need to change it in this one place here. So I say my limit is equal to my limit. Now I'm going to pass this in my input clause here. Let's go back to our timeline and we can refresh. Let's like this tweet, unlike it, and you can see that this now works. So that is how to create a Twitter clone with the T3 stack. If you like this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below what you do to your application.